Welcome to our online audience and to those of you in the room. My name is Ian Mitchell. I'm the co-director of the Centre for Global Development's Europe programme, and I lead a lot of our government-facing climate finance work. And this event is titled New Finance Goals and Political Realities, How to Deliver on Climate and Development. And a particularly warm welcome to our distinguished speakers, Valerie Hickey, who's the Global Director for Climate Change at the World Bank, and who I know when you get people's bios, I also discovered you have a PhD in environmental science and policy.
I'm so shocked to you.
And so yeah, vastly more qualified than I am on this agenda.
Not at all, but thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And Debbie Palmer, who's Director for Energy, Climate and Environment at the SCDO. And you look nervous now, Debbie, like I'm going to mention something from your past.
I don't have a PhD in anything environmental.
But you were FCDO Director for Africa, and you've worked in a number of lower income countries, including Nigeria, Malawi, Indonesia, and Pakistan, I believe. So, eminently qualified to talk about this, and we're really lucky to have you both. I just wanted to say something about the reason we thought this was a good conversation to have. And I think, 6 months ago at the last COP, there was a new climate finance goal achieved, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But of course, there's been very significant changes, politically and geopolitically, if you like, and not limited to the election of President Trump, who seems set to reduce the US climate finance contribution to zero, major aid cuts in the UK, but also in other developed European countries. And then, of course, also the escalation in the conflict in the Middle East and ongoing conflicts elsewhere. So, I think we're talking about quite a different world here. But that doesn't mean our climate and finance ambitions mean nothing, and they remain important both for the direct impact they have, and I think in motivating emerging economies and developing economies to step up their own climate ambition. And I think we talk about a transactional, approach to international affairs, and at one level, the climate finance is completely transactional for that reason, I think, and we'll talk to the panelists about their view on that. The other reason I wanted to have this conversation, we should talk about how much climate finance there is, but we've felt for a long time there isn't enough discussion about the quality and impact of climate finance. And that always gets neglected in these discussions about quantity. So I want to leave plenty of time to talk about that and ask the two institutions how they see that and what they're thinking about in terms of maximising. And then finally, we'll probably get on, I think, to what happens at the coming COP. Possibly what's happened in Bonn and what's being agreed. But I'd love to get the panelists' advice on what advocates and people that care about development should be thinking about in the run-up to COP. So that's our agenda. So let's go back to the start. Debbie, if I may start with you and talk about the COP agreement on the new collective quantified goal from last year. How ambitious a goal is 300 billion a year by 2035? And going back to this point I made at the introduction, do you see it as a motivation for developing countries' emissions plans, and how much of a motivation plan is it?
Super. Thanks, Ian, and thanks very much for having me today. It's lovely to have the chance to talk to everybody. So the NCQG for me was significant. It was significant because it was hard fought. It was significant because we really didn't know right through the process of COP29 whether we were going to reach an agreement. And we did, and that is something that should be prized and should be valued, and which we should use as the basis for continuing to move forward. Of course, 300 billion was couched as a very clear target and aspiration, but sitting within a 1.3 trillion aspirational figure. And I think it's really important that we see the two together, and that we have a very hard, very clear commitment to get to that 300 billion, and we must do that, and we must honour our promises. But within that, we also need to focus on an all sources approach to get ourselves up to that more aspirational end of this focus. And I think that, so I've spent a lot of time travelling since we were all in Azerbaijan, and I have spent time talking to my counterparts from lots of other countries around the world, including I had a great conversation with colleagues in India and partners there. And of course, many countries were disappointed with the quantum and were concerned that it should have been bigger. And I want to sort of recognise that and say, certainly on the part of the British government, we are going to continue to press for ambition. And we see the 300 billion as a starting point and a commitment that we have collectively all agreed to sign up to. But we need to keep pressing, and we need to keep thinking about all those sources and using all of those levers and get them on the table.
Great. And I want to come on to both of those things, both the 1.3 trillion and the different contributions to it. But just if I could just stay with you for a second in terms of the wider partners you've spoken to. I mean, a number of, France, Germany, a number of other European countries have also announced cuts to their aid budget. How is the group of developed countries collectively seeing 300 billion in the light of that cut?
So, as I said, we all made a commitment. We've all got to keep working for it. The economics are changing. The fiscal picture is changing, and absolutely many donors, including the UK, has had to reassess how much finance it can afford to provide through ODA. And we've all heard the British Prime Minister make those decisions based on the fact that we have a war in Europe, the fact that there are real pressures in terms of defence spending. So every polity is going to have to come to these decisions and work out how it's balancing all the pressures upon it. Nevertheless, the science around climate is not changing. We know the commitments are needed. We as the UK government want to honour our commitments. We retain an ambition to stay really focused on this space. And even in the recent announcements from the Chancellor, where she's had to start looking at actually how much money is available, you will have seen that the British government has said climate, nature, energy remains one of our very top priorities. So I think the message from the sort of highest couldn't be clearer about the commitment to this agenda. How we go about it may need to change, and that I think is the space that we will need to start getting into, and we can move on to in this conversation.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And Valerie, Debbie mentioned the 1.3 trillion and seeing that as the 300 in that context. What do you expect to see in that trillion between the 300 and the 1.3? What kinds of finance are we talking about there? Does the bank have a role to play in mobilising that? Help people understand what might be in that quantum once it's agreed.
So we think less about the 1.3 trillion than we do about the 3.5 trillion, which is about what's going to be needed every year from all sources to tackle climate change, both on the mitigation and the adaptation. And for us, that means leverage becomes the watchword that we all have to think about. Because that's why for us, we've been so grateful to, whether it's the government of UK, all of our shareholders who continue to see the role of the World Bank Group and our sister MDBs to continue to put our capital where their commitments are and to continue to apply. That's why last year at Baku, we made the commitment that as an MDB family, we would be putting $120 billion on the table every year starting in 2030 and would mobilize an additional $65 billion a year in private capital. But again, that's not anywhere near enough, the $3.5 trillion that we estimate is needed. That's why catalyzation matters. That's why leverage matters. We have to figure out how do we turn that $1 into 4 or 5. That's why, for example, IDA continues to be one of the best bets in development and in climate, because for every dollar that we get from our generous donors, we're able to turn that into $4. And that's how we're going to go from the 300 billion to the 3.5 trillion. But the other places that we have to move to is not about external resources. We have to have a serious conversation about domestic resource mobilization. And we think at the MDBs, we have a role in doing that too. It's about subsidy repurposing, for example. Every year in agriculture, almost $700 billion are spent directly investing in agriculture that by and large is actually accelerating climate change. We're not suggesting you take away that money for farmers. We're suggesting, and we're seeing in countries, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Zambia, across the middle income to low income country spectrum, countries being willing to rethink their subsidies, to move away from giving them for the consumption of chemical fertilizers, for example, to move upstream to support extension services, which have been withering away for years, which are so important to farmers to understand what's the latest technology, to know how to deploy those technologies, to think about more R&D so you get better heat-resistant seeds in places like the Sahel. That suddenly will move a lot of money. That's already there. It doesn't add $1 to a government's budget because it's $1 they're already spending. They're just now going to spend it instead of in a way that drives up their long-term costs, in a way that actually makes them more resilient and allows them to take advantage of climate opportunities and climate technology. So that's where we think the more interesting conversation is, that it's the 300 to 3.5, and we have to keep the focus not just on the solidarity that all the countries of the so-called global north have done by putting the 300 billion on the table, but solidarity means everybody's in this together. And that means we have to think about domestic resource mobilization as well.
Interesting. I spent most of my time in government working on the EU Common Agricultural Policy, and 40% of the EU budget, as you say, at best unhelpful to societal to benefits.
As the daughter of family farmers in Ireland,
right,
seeing that change from the time we acceded to the European Union in the 1970s to now,
yeah,
and what farmers get paid to do, the Common Agricultural Policy is actually an example of how you can repurpose. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. But done is better than perfect, and there's some nice repurposing done there too.
Excellent. I'll talk about agriculture all day if you let me. Can I stay with you a bit, Valerie? I mean, the other obvious factor here for the World Bank is, your largest shareholder has gone from being a climate leader to an extreme skeptic. So can you say something about how that's being handled in the bank, how that might affect what you're doing, and how you're thinking about that now?
So I think we're very lucky as a member bank. All of our shareholders, including the US, continues to push us on the climate agenda. Because as Debbie said, nobody's debating the science. Everybody knows it's hotter. You just had to be here over the weekend to recognize that. And that's in a place where you can get out of the heat. Everybody knows what's happening in places like the Sahel or Southern Africa, where drought is the slow motion misery that's killing everybody. Nobody's doubting that. Nobody's looking at floods and the increase in sudden shocks everywhere and hurricanes and cyclones and thinking those aren't real. And that's why all of our shareholders, including the US, are very much pushing us to make sure we are still committing 45% of our capital to climate finance. Because we're a climate bank, but we're also an infrastructure bank. We're a health bank, we're an education bank. I think what's been missing sometimes in the conversation, because we're often talking to each other, is that we use terms like climate finance and assume everybody knows what we mean. Well, some people think climate finance means renewable energy, and that somehow as the World Bank Group, we're spending 45% of our capital on renewable energy. We're not. Yes, we're spending a lot of our energy budget on renewable energy, but climate finance is also making sure that schools are places where kids can come and they're not dying in the heat and they can't come because there's no ventilation. Or it's making sure that agriculture is resistant to drought, is actually keeping up with the changing weather so that productivity can be increased. That's why I think increasingly when we work on the climate agenda, we're talking about this in terms of an opportunity agenda. It's an opportunity for countries to take advantage of lots of new technologies. We're in the midst of a new industrial revolution. We want to make sure the poorest countries in the world and the poor communities in every country aren't on the losing end of that transition. But then we also want to make sure that as climate change changes hydrological cycles, changes weather patterns, that again, the poorest communities, the poorest people aren't the ones on the losing end, that we help them adapt. And that's just good development. And that's where the sooner we depoliticize the climate agenda and start explaining that to be a development bank means you have to be a climate bank. You have to be an education bank. You have to be an agriculture bank. I think it helps all of our shareholders. It reflects, I think, where they want to see us. Because at the end of the day, our bottom line is getting people out of poverty, and we can't do that without a livable planet.
Very good. And just for, I said one of the reasons we wanted to put this event on was because I think, climate advocates in the UK who are interested in the finance agenda maybe don't appreciate the role of the multilateral development banks. And at last year's COP, there were projections set out by the MDBs worked together to set out projections. Do you mind just reminding us of what those reports said and what your plans are on climate finance in the coming years?
So for us, as a system of 10 sibling MDBs, we're putting $120 billion a year from our own balance sheet. And then we've committed to ensure that that unlocks at least 65 billion in private capital. Now, you may wonder, how is it if you're putting 120 billion on the table? That's not great leverage to get only 50 cents in private capital. You have to remember that an awful lot of our finance is in policy reform, for example. And even though over time that will lead to private capital mobilization, it leads to jobs, it leads to the adoption of new technologies, it repurposes and phases out subsidies that aren't working for the country, you can't immediately attribute that to private capital mobilization. So one of the things as MDBs is we're always conservative. We don't see climate as a place where we want to make up numbers. For us, it's very important that when we put a number out there, it is robust and it is backed by a very clear taxonomy. It's also why for Belém, for the next COP in Brazil, we're committed to deliver a catalyzation taxonomy. Catalyzation is that private capital we know happens, but happens a little bit over time. It's not the immediate next step. It's not money that is added onto a deal sheet for every deal we do. But we know that because of money we put on the table, through, for example, a demonstration effect where we'll do the first solar, off-grid solar facility, and all of a sudden the private capital comes in because they see they can replicate this, and we have a demonstration effect. We're creating that capitalization taxonomy so we can very carefully show how our money, again in a conservative way, showing that this was the intent of our money to have that demonstration effect or to make sure this money came to the table. Because again, to get to that 3.5 trillion, it's going to have to come from everywhere. Private sector has to be part of it. And private sector itself doesn't always in every country have a climate finance target, but we want to be able to show how much of that money is flowing and supports the climate agenda.
Great. And let me just ask you one more question before I come to Debbie in the UK, if I may. And I mean, you can have a look at CGD's done work on projecting climate finance towards 2035, and you can see the MDB element of that, you know, being very significant, especially as all shareholders will now contribute to that. I mean, you mentioned the 120 billion and then the 65 mobilization. Earlier, you said you want to mobilize more. Isn't there a necessary trade-off there, though? I mean, if you want to mobilize, if you want high mobilization ratios, doesn't that mean less concessional finance in middle-income countries? And isn't there a tension there with the kind of grant finance for adaptation that developing countries have called for repeatedly at COP?
So we don't think so. If you look at our IDA finance, for example, which we had very generous contributions pledged by many countries, not just in the global north, but some in the global south as well. And we hope to have an overall envelope of between 90 and $100 billion. A third of that will be in grant finance. Now that money is going to go to the 70 plus least developing countries in the world. We expect that money to mobilize private sector. We expect part of that money to begin to formalize the informal small, medium-sized enterprises in these countries, which are where 90% of jobs come from. And it's where all of the emissions are coming from in those countries. And these are the businesses that need to formalize so they can take advantage of getting access to local capital, so they can take advantage of new technology, so they can become here and there the new multinationals of the future. So we don't see it as a trade-off necessarily between where we put our money and you only get private capital mobilization in middle-income countries. You also absolutely get it in least developed countries. You absolutely get it in every country, because everywhere it's the private sector that is 90% of the jobs. It's the private sector that is running all of the businesses, all of the sectors that are generating emissions and finding emission savings. So we don't think it's a trade-off. We actually see it as a win-win. And that if we're not bringing the private money to the table, we're not doing development.
Very good, very good. I mean, that takes us neatly actually on to you, Debbie. So we're at I've heard colleagues call it a landmark year for the UK's contributions on climate finance. It's the end of the 5-year 11.6 billion ODA target and the start of a new period. You know, as you know, there'll be 40% of cuts to ODA on average. Can you tell us where the UK, the Prime Minister's made clear that climate and nature are his priorities for the UK's aid and finance. Can you tell us where we are in the process of prioritisation and what you expect the UK to be able to contribute on climate finance in the coming years?
Yeah, certainly. So as you said, the Prime Minister at the end of February made clear that the UK's international development budget, our ODA budget, would be reduced to 0.3% of GNI. So that's something that we've been working with ever since then. The Chancellor obviously last week then set out the spending plans. And at the moment, a large amount of what she focused on was, of course, domestic. I would point out that it was a huge amount of domestic clean energy infrastructure investment in that settlement. Indeed, some really impressive things that are going to be happening for the UK in terms of clean energy, pivot into nuclear, etc. We could talk about that, but I think that is one part of the UK government's really strong commitment to net zero and to clean energy, and wanting to very much walk the talk on this agenda. In terms of then the broader piece on the ODA, as I said, the Chancellor has made clear, the Foreign Secretary has made clear that climate, energy, nature will be one of the top priorities going forward, will remain very much a centrepiece of what is happening. That, I think, reflects the language the Foreign Secretary used last September when he gave his Q lecture. And he talked about, for example, the fact that climate and nature should be at the centre of everything that the Foreign Office does, and that he sees this truly as a system-wide issue that we need to be focused on. So there will be less money in terms of ODA, but the priority for climate, for nature, for energy remains very much front and centre of what the government's trying to do.
Thank you. And we did a study a couple of years ago looking at the UK's British investment partnerships, which was a kind of flagship initiative under the last government. And I guess what we discovered there was, there's export finance, there's the use of guarantees. These things are mobilising climate finance for the UK, but they don't count in the 11.6 billion. I think we'd all prefer a situation where climate finance was additional to aid, where it was grant-based, where it was adaptation focused. But is it fair to say that in the next phase of climate finance, the UK will be paying more attention, showcasing more what it's doing beyond ODA on finance?
So I think what this government wants to do is certainly be able to look across the suite of tools and be able to see ODA as a very important part of the puzzle, but not the totality of the puzzle. And I think what you can hear from our ministers is that they are absolutely determined that we are much more mindful and deliberate about all of the levers that we can pull. So you mentioned guarantees, you mentioned our DFI, BII. We could talk about equally the role we have, forgive me, on the World Bank board and leveraging our board seats in the multilaterals. We want you to go further. We want you to go faster. We want to scale and leverage the balance sheet by stretching them and ensuring that the World Bank and others are mainstreaming resilience and nature into your planning. So I think across the system, I could say the same thing about UK expertise, for example, and making sure that we're drawing, as we already do, but perhaps in an even more deliberate fashion, on the huge range of experts we've got here in the UK. We talked about the number of people in London who are focused on these issues. How can we bring the totality of the UK offer to bear against this problem set, against the challenge of how we're working internationally on climate, nature and energy? So that is not to dodge the issue that the aid budget has been cut to 0.3. And again, ministers, I think, are absolutely determined we need to make every pound work harder. We need to ensure that we are really deliberate on what we're trying to achieve. We need to ensure that there are multipliers in terms of how we leverage the money. And we also need to ensure, frankly, that the international system is as efficient and effective as possible in terms of looking at that broader architecture. How are we drawing on all of those sources, but how also are we ensuring that that whole system works together to become more than the sum of its parts, rather than what at the moment is quite a fragmented and sometimes duplicative picture.
Great. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, and I wanted to come in on this because I don't think at all it's dodging. I think it's actually maturing the approach, because if you just look at the carbon markets, for example, the carbon markets have been something we've all wanted to work better, because they're one of those great markets that twin a commitment to decarbonization to raising money for sustainable development that then would be used for further decarbonization. So it's exactly the kind of market we want. And yet it's not working. Largely it's not working because corporates are sitting on the sideline concerned about not having any regulatory safe haven. What they want are guarantees. And this is why, for example, this morning, the governments of UK, Kenya, and Singapore launched a new coalition of the working to find out what are the instruments needed to get corporates off the sidelines and into the market to be high integrity buyers for the increasing supply of high integrity suppliers that are on the market. That takes things like guarantees. It's those de-risking instruments. And so if we want to move from a conversation around quantity, which can only go up so much further, we have to be realistic. We have to talk about quality. And part of that conversation on quality is around the multiplicity of instruments and the importance of leverage and the importance of figuring out how to use money where and when and the least amount you need in order to unblock something that will cause impact. And so this to me is a really important part of the discussion that I actually don't think we should be poo-pooing these other instruments. I don't think grants are always the best thing to do. I think we all in our personal lives know, you know, if we go and take a loan to fix our house up, we're probably much more serious than if a neighbor gives it or a family member gives us a little bit of money. There is something to be said for sweat equity and for managing money that you have to pay back and that you have to think about differently. So we shouldn't poo-poo all the various instruments. They're actually critical.
No, for sure. And actually, I mean, maybe that takes us on to a question about policy rather than spend, because I think we had a session here last week on value for money in climate finance, and one of the messages coming out of that was kind of the importance of policy change. And Debbie rightly reminded me that, you know, the UK's contribution is reducing its emissions at home as well as its climate finance contribution, but focusing on the kind of developing country aspect. I mean, the bank has, you know, policy lending where it lends to countries and it asks for certain policies to be achieved. Do you see that, Valerie, as something that the bank can make more of? And Debbie, is that one of the things on your wish list for MDBs to do more of, to use that, you know, the conditionality of the finance being a policy change in relation to climate?
I have to say the UK uses its board seat incredibly well to push us exactly in this direction, and have for a long time, to use the 40% of the IBRD IDA, the public sector side of the World Bank Group's finance, is used for policy finance. And it's a really important lever because policy reform is the cheapest way to drive impact. And it's the cheapest way to drive down future problems. That's how you drive down and avoid future emissions. And that's incredibly important. And thinking through how to have a climate pillar, thinking about what's the regulation we need. And again, it's not just in climate. It's not just about having a climate policy or setting up a good system to make sure your NDC is robust. It's about looking at subsidies in different sectors. It's about figuring out in transport, how do you push for more bus rapid transit, for example? It's thinking through how do you create the policy incentives to shift freight from road to rail. And that's why with policy incentives, with policy changes, which are very, very cheap to do, you can have huge impact. And that's why we increasingly look, whether it's to make sure countries have the regulation to be part of carbon markets globally, or to create carbon pricing instruments that raised $100 billion in revenue last year alone. That's what we're using more and more of our policy finance for. And it's a critical tool in the tool belt.
Yeah, and we got some work from you and Richie coming out soon on how the bank approaches climate in partner countries. And I think what comes through is kind of the understanding that bank teams have on the ground of what the energy system is and the alternative. And I think when we're talking to our bilaterals and countries, I think that's a question we pose is, you know, have you got the capacity to understand that and participate?
But by the way, this is why things like country platforms can be so important. Now, country platforms with a small c and a small p, not a particular one size fits all, but rather getting the multilaterals with the bilaterals, with key philanthropies working in a country to sit together with the country at the head of the table, deciding together based on robust analytics, what's the priority spend? What needs to happen that will cause the greatest impact? And how do we do it together so that instead of having a whole that's less than the sum of the parts, which I think is what's happening in some countries, that we really begin to do more together. And that's where sometimes having less money can be a great sort of decision forcing tool to make everybody come together and be a little bit more careful.
Absolutely. So that takes us neatly back to you, Devi. I mean, I think I'd love to hear your views on country platforms. You know, I suppose I'm a little bit skeptical that in a world where people are becoming more nationalistic, they're likely to coordinate more as providers. But I wonder if you could tell us something, you know, that for those of us that have been in government for a spending review, that is quite a serious zero-based exercise looking at every line of spend. And, you know, 40% is such a steep cut that it must make you look fundamentally at what you're doing. So can you first tell us a bit about the spending review process and the extent to which that's been able to look at the impact of different parts? And are there any clues there? I mean, there are several climate multilaterals at the UK funds. There's obviously IDA, which we don't know about yet. What can you say about how FCDO and the government are thinking about impact and value for money?
Yeah, super. Thanks, Ian. So to start off with the spending review process, yes, it has been very rigorous. I've spent many hours in the last 3 months focusing purely on that set of issues. We've worked very, very collaboratively across government to really think about the totality of our offer in the financial space as the British government. And as you said, to really think about where are we getting the impact? What does the value for money look like? How do we get the synergies across the government? How do we situate, as I said, the ODA we're spending in amongst all the other levers that we've got to drive progress? I would say that the Chancellor has announced the spending review. We all now have our departmental allocations. If you'll forgive me, the process continues. So we haven't reached the end of the process yet. So within each government department, we are now doing our internal work to then drill down and look at exactly what the allocation should be it by geography, be it by theme, be it by instrument, etc. So that work is not yet finalised, and that will continue over the next little while. But the long and short is, we in the UK, we have I am very proud of our tradition to focus on quality, to focus on impact, to focus on value for money. That will continue. We also have a very proud tradition of working, certainly across our development programme, looking at the poorest and most vulnerable. That will continue. We have historically, over the previous period, thought about mitigation, adaptation, finance, nature. Those are all themes that you should expect to see us continue and stay very, very committed to across the piece. So on the one hand, a real focus on the right tool for the job, making sure we're thinking about our instrument set and what we're trying to achieve, thinking about where the most concessional money is going, and making sure that we are focusing the most concessional money and the precious grant finance on the poorest, and thinking about what other levers that we have, what other tools in the toolbox to work with other countries that maybe have a little bit more resource themselves through domestic mobilisation, through their own banks, through their own pension funds, etc., to put into this challenge. Strongly agree with Valerie. Ultimately, policy reform is the biggest best value for money you can get in terms of trying to support a country. But in all of our conversation about leveraging and about working with other countries, there are a set of countries that are very, very poor, that are the sharpest end of the impact of climate. We need to ensure across our development and climate work that we're absolutely seeing them as two sides of the same coin. I know there's some challenging politics about what gets counted and what doesn't get counted, and that isn't the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that if you want to support the poorest people to move forward in terms of their own growth and development, we need their infrastructure, we need their human capital all to be resilient, we need their agriculture to be resilient. And if we want to support countries cope with climate impacts, the best and most resilient sort of activity they could do is to move forward with their development. So the development and the climate resilience, for me, are very much two sides of the same coin. And we will therefore want all of our sort of levers and our financing across the UK government to be able to address both sides of that coin, and not to get caught up on sort of strange bifurcations across the piece. So for me, there's a big story about, as I said, making sure the concessionality goes to the right places, really thinking about, yes, quantity, but also quality, impact, VFM, targeting the poorest, and ultimately then thinking about how we can use, if you like, the whole system to become more the sum of its parts. For example, BII, our DFI, has been invested in one of India's biggest renewable companies, Ayana. This year, BII exited from that top 10 company. So it's mobilized over $1 billion by exiting, which it's now in one single investment. It's now got that money that it can recycle and use to fund new investments. We saw the same sort of thing at COP29 last year with the launch of the CIF capital market mechanism. Investments that the British government made over 10 years ago, from 2008 when the CIFS was established, along with other partners, now being mobilised and brought into the market in order to mobilise potentially now 75 billion in new money. And again, that sort of thing, thinking about the whole system and the life cycle of the money is really, really important.
Great, thanks. And so I just wanted to highlight, I think sometimes, development advocates in the UK and climate advocates sometimes take these things for granted, but you said, the UK will keep assessing value for money and impact. I mean, you can't necessarily take that for granted in a world of geopolitical competition, I think, and also, focusing efforts on the poorest countries. I think again, that's something that the manifesto for Labour said, but which I'm really glad to hear is a central part of your thinking. I'm sure there are people in the room that may want to ask you some further difficult questions about what the UK will do on ICF, and we'll get to those. So I just want a couple more minutes to ask you a couple of things, and then we'll open up to questions. So I think we're right up to date with where we are. There's 6 months left till the next COP. There's ongoing work on the so-called road to Belém and the 1.3 trillion we've talked about. What do you both think? And Valerie, perhaps you would go first. What should advocates of climate and development be thinking about in that 6 months? What do you think COP can and should achieve in that period? What should we be working on?
I mean, I think there's two key things when it comes to climate finance that we're interested in. One is really thinking through, how do you turn the 300 billion into the 300? And that means not getting stuck on the politics of who gives the money, but rather how to use the money. And that means thinking about impact, thinking about indicators, thinking about AAA data that is accurate, accessible, and affordable, so that you can drive the money to where it makes the biggest impact. Because we all agree with the principle for value for money, even at a time when there was lots of money. I think we all believe that money should be spent where it's best used and has the best impact. The challenge has been often we don't have the data to prove that. And so we do need to invest in data that is not noise, but can provide a signal. Because in lots of places, there is lots of data and people are drowning in data in some sectors. You can't tell the noise from the signal, but we need to get that signal from the data to know where we can provide money that will give us the biggest bang for our buck. But that's the second thing. We have to have biggest bang for the buck on both the mitigation side of the ledger and the adaptation side. I think the COPs for a long time, understandably, have been riven by debates about how to bend the curve of emissions to zero the fastest, which we have to do because we'll never catch up on adaptation if we don't get mitigation under control. We know that. But at the same time, we have to figure out how to spend better on adaptation. We've been following the global goal for adaptation, which will be discussed at COP. It was just discussed at Bonn. We're glad that the number of indicators of success has come down from like 3,000 to 400, but 400 is still too many. I think we have to figure out what are the indicators that can help us identify where to drive investment, remembering that adaptation looks different for different communities, and we have to think through how do we make sure we're getting the best bang for the buck without ignoring the poorest places where it may be more expensive, places like the Sahel where multidimensional poverty means making people resilient against climate change is not easy. It's not a one-shot deal. It's going to take a lot of money and a lot of thinking. So it may not give you the most number of people immediately you can get out of vulnerability, but those men and women who are living with that slow motion misery that's made worse by climate change, we can't ignore them either. Yeah. So those are the two things and make sure we focus on.
And what are the dimensions of that? Where is vulnerability and how does that affect where you target? And Jonathan Byrne, my colleague, is doing some work on that, which I think will be coming out soon as well. Debbie, what's on your COP suggestion, proposal, wish, worry list?
Yes, I've got a very long shopping list for COP30, as you'd expect, across a whole spectrum of issues. Obviously, we're going to have a UN synthesis report on NDCs coming up mid-year. That's very high on my agenda. We really need an offer in the adaptation and resilience space. I have great hopes of COP30 in terms of forests and nature. So there's a lot going on. But to come back to the finance space in particular, obviously we are all really awaiting the Baku to Belém roadmap and looking forward to seeing what that offers us. And that's going to be a key milestone for COP30. And what we really would like to see is an opportunity to think about scalable solutions and how do we unlock private finance at scale. Linked to it, we hope some financial reforms, including thinking about how is our collective architecture, how do we need to gradually evolve? How do we need to build those new sources in order to create a viable pathway to 1.3 trillion? We've talked a lot here about the private sector, and of course, the more that we can do to think about how the private sector can contribute to the green transition, how are we going to unlock those institutional investors? How are we going to get financial actors more comfortable with emerging market developing economies, thinking about those investments? I heard just this morning that actually the data shows that, for example, in terms of real estate investment, the risks over the last decade in emerging markets and developing economies were no different in terms of bad loans than the advanced economies. And yet the perception of risk is really, really different. How do we come together with the private sector and help support that assessment of risk? How do we help partners really think about their own resilience and start quantifying the costs of resilience and quantifying the risks, and really help, for example, the private sector get into that space where they're looking at their own supply chains to understand what risks that they have. So, as I said, we need to think about all the sources, and we need to think about how we create a really inclusive process. Yeah, very interesting. And all the sources point is a challenge for all of us, I think, to think about those new policy areas and what might happen there. So let me open it up for questions. We'll start in the room. If you're watching online, there's a link you can follow on YouTube or on the event page to pose your question, and my colleague Ed is collating those, and we can come to those in a moment. But let me start here and see if we have any questions for our panel in the room. Okay, I'll go Charlie, and then the lady here, and then Rachel. Christina, could you just introduce yourself as well?
Sure. Charlie Matthews here with WaterAid, and I just wanted to pick up the conversation around kind of grant versus private finance and on the global goal for adaptation in particular. You know, we are quite encouraged with where the global goals going in terms of the kind of water indicators, but we are a bit more worried that there is quite a big gap on the means of implementation piece. You know, I hear what you're saying, that, you know, you think private sector can be mobilized in least developed countries and for these harder sectors, but you know, only 1.7% of WASH financing at the moment is private sector. There is such a long way to go there. And colleagues of mine who were spending time with the LDC negotiators in Bonn last week have said that they're just not willing to accept that the means of implementation and the adaptation finance should be private sector. They think it needs to be grants. So I just wanted your views on kind of how we can overcome that gap and kind of get to where we need to be so that the global goal can really fulfill its potential. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. Let's take those together. This lady in the front, please, Christina. Just introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Pauline Lewis. I'm an accountant. I live in London. I've been attending quite a few of these events, and I attended the event this morning about the South Alliance Women Network, and it was quite heartbreaking to hear about how they can't access finances that they need at the grassroots levels. There's issues around getting support. They've got expensive consultants coming in and taking quite a lot of the finance. They need proper legal documents. They need a whole infrastructure around the grant funding, which is really essential because women, you know, they give birth to children, they're linked to nature, and these are in countries in Indonesia, Tanzania, the Maasai tribe in Tanzania, Kenya. So these are emerging countries that we talk about, but actually what's happening at the grassroots level in terms of biodiversity and protecting these communities.
Right, thank you. And then Rachel. introduce yourself, please.
Hi, Rachel Glenister, President of Centre for Global Development. I wanted to pick up on the point, Valerie, you mentioned several times about resilience in agriculture and, you know, new seeds and things. And I was just really struck, you've got multilateral, bilateral sitting there. There's a real challenge of multilaterals being able to fund innovation in the climate space. You know, seeds is one of them, but there are many other places where we need innovation. And so my question is really about, you know, I see bilaterals as really the only people who can fund innovation, but just to explain why, like if you're doing a loan to an individual country, they are not going to borrow to develop the new seed that is going to be used across the whole of West Africa. So, you know, it's maybe I'm wrong, maybe you are getting people to borrow to do that, but in which case, like how are the bilaterals going to fill that gap?
Great, thank you, Rachel. Debbie, do you want to start with the one on the global goal on adaptation and how it relates to water and private mobilisation from Charlie?
Yeah, certainly. Thanks for a great question. So we also are looking eagerly at the GGA and hoping that it can come to fruition this year. It's been a very long road, and we'd love to sort of reach a point where we've got a model that we can all agree on and all use to move forward. I mean, I want to agree with the central thesis of your question, which is that grant finance is really important and it remains very, very precious. I 100% ascribe to that. The challenge we've got in front of us is there's simply less grant finance around. So the bottom line for me is we need to ensure it gets to the places it needs to get to where it's most needed, where there are fewer alternatives, and we need to ensure that it has maximum impact when it gets there. There is, I think, very happily a thriving effort at the moment going into things like locally led adaptation to really recognise that there is a gap in terms of the implementation and delivery at the most local level. And we need to support countries around the world to ensure that the money gets into the hands of local communities and that local communities can be in the driving seat in terms of decision making, because we know that's how the money becomes most effective and most impactful. So I want to agree with the spirit of your question. Of course, it's really challenging to get there, but that's the task ahead of us, I think, between now and COP30.
And Debbie, have you got anything on Pauline's questions about, you know, the South Alliance and Women's Network? And I mean, in a sense, that's local issues and making sure the money gets there.
Yeah, certainly. So I think across the climate space, if I'm honest, we probably haven't done nearly enough in terms of thinking about gender and thinking about how we engage properly with women's networks in the Global South. It's something our ministers are very passionate about. At COP29, I was really blown away. The best attended event that I went to in the whole of that COP was with women's groups from the Global South. And it was such an impressive event in terms of the innovation, ingenuity, passion, commitment in that room, determination to just try and really grab hold of some empowerment and opportunity to make things happen. But we're not where we need to get to. And it's something that we need to keep focused on. So thank you. Keep holding us to account to do better, because I think as a whole community, there is still an awful lot more work. As I said, this work on locally led adaptation, I think is one way of coming into this. We're also focused very much on Indigenous people and local communities. And again, it's something that Foreign Secretary is very, very focused on. We know that Indigenous people and local communities are far and away the best stewards of the natural resources in our world. And we know we need stronger stewards. So for me, it's a bit of a no-brainer. This is something that we need to keep working on because it's the right thing to do, but it's also the most effective thing to do.
And if I can add, I think there are some great examples, Pauline, of where a small amount of grant financing has been used to provide that access, whether it's to women's groups or to Indigenous peoples groups. The CIFs, the Climate Investment Funds, invested in something called the Dedicated Grant Mechanism through the World Bank, providing small grants to Indigenous-led organizations to build up their capacity to engage in climate finance and carbon markets. Because part of the challenge is they just need a little bit of money to attend meetings, to learn, to build up their own institutional governance so they can partake. And that's really, really important. And this is where regulation helps. We've been working in Brazil, for example, In the state of Amazonas, they have a payment for environmental service, a conditional cash transfer program called Bolsa Floresta. And as part of working with them, one of the conditionalities for the cash transfer is that women are given access to more of the money so they can start small businesses. But this is where I wanted to respond a little bit to Rachel's question about innovation. One, to say that I think we do fund investment. For example, just in agriculture, the bank is one of the anchor investors in the CG system, the Collaborative Group for International Agricultural Research. And so we are driving innovation through those centers. So we do drive innovation, but sometimes boring is best. I mean, one of the things that we will not give up in the sexy race for innovation is things like land titling for women. I mean, in places like Burundi and the Sahel, Burundi and in the Sahel, and places where men are leaving because they're going to chase cash income in the mines and DRC. If you're in Burundi, in the Sahel, they're going to big cities. Women are left on the farms because women don't have the legal right to own land in some of these countries, or the administrative burdens to get their name on land certificates are so hard. They can't go to their local money market and get the small business loan they need to go and start a small business that can bring in income, or take the loan out to put their kids through school. So it's not particularly sexy, but getting women access to land as collateral, getting them legal tenure to that land is boring. It's not particularly innovative, but it's absolutely fundamental. So I think while we do invest in innovation, we're also quite clear that sometimes boring can be the best investment to get the plumbing right, to make sure we can get the money to where it needs to go. But then I will say also to Charlie's question, I think sometimes we don't explain what we mean by private sector, because to stick to the agriculture example, there's 550 million farms. Each one of them is a private sector enterprise. I think too often when we think private sector, we think Unilever. But I mean the little family farm. My family's farm back home when I was growing up is a private sector enterprise. It wasn't particularly lucrative. And those farmers, those 550 million family farms, are putting their own money on the table that for adaptation. That is private sector investment in adaptation. They're going and taking out loans. They're going and securing advanced market commitments if they're part of a supply chain, so that they can get access to new technology, including nature-based technology, so they can get biofertilizers, for example, or figure out how do you place trees on farms to get better water retention. So it's not always grants versus private sector. It's thinking about what the private sector is and who they are and what that means, and then using grants to make sure that it plugs those holes where you need an external source of finance, where the return on investment just isn't there. So no one's going to borrow for it.
Thanks, Valerie. And I also, again, for sort of UK development advocates in the room, I think the other place that we need to think about is, you know, Department of Science, Innovation and Technology has got a good spending review settlement, and a smaller portion of what they're doing is going to be counted as aid, but they should be working on climate change and funding the sorts of innovation that I think Rachel is thinking about. And we need to start thinking more broadly about that, as probably Debbie does as well. But let me not let her respond to that and get one last round of questions. I've got Joe, then I'll come to Ed for some questions online, and then Rob and gentlemen here. Let's see at that point whether we've got time for a couple more.
Thank you. This is Joe Thwaites from the Natural Resources Defence Council. I think a lot of what you said makes a lot of sense. You know, we need to do better at mobilising private finance. We need to be using policy-based approaches, looking at shifting domestic subsidies. But we also need that core of public finance. And I think the maths up to 2030 is fine. I'm like, you know, back of the envelope. I think the MDB's joint announcement at COP was extremely useful in building the confidence to go higher on the NCQG on the 300 billion. But I think beyond 2030, we don't know what the MDB commitment is. I'm assuming the MDBs hold to it, you know, and that the geopolitical problems we have at the moment aren't going to erode that. But and I think the MDB growth up to 2030 will compensate a lot for the bilateral cuts, but it won't compensate for the quality, because a lot of that growth is coming in lending, not in grants. And then beyond 2030, it gets really difficult without new bilateral commitments or innovative sources of finance, such as levies on shipping and aviation and fossil fuels and things like that. So I think, first of all, it would be great to hear, not immediately, I know you got a few years to deliver on the 2030 targets, but from the MDBs, what they're thinking about post 2030, but also from rich countries, and the NCQG bringing in other contributors was, I think, helpful. But I think on budget financing is very difficult, but I think innovative sources, more on that, because you're going to need the public base.
Thank you, Joe. Could you just pass the microphone back to Ed and then Rob?
Thanks, Ian. We have a few questions online, but I'll stick to one, and that is, how are FCDO and the World Bank considering adaptation limits, and how are you incorporating possible future uninhabitability and the need to plan and finance relocations?
Great. And then Rob.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, guys. Rob from E3G. We published a report this morning, which is in all of your inboxes, Valerie, Debbie, Ian, so please read that. My question speaks to some of the points we make in it. So it's a two-parter. One,
Rob, pick one, Rob. Pick one.
I mean, they're very linked.
We'll look at the report.
What we are seeing at the moment, and it links to a lot of the points around public finance, private finance, withdrawal, we're having to move from having to be more efficient and effective to having to do more with less, which is essentially the same fundamental challenge. One of the big things that we see with that, and we've had some discussions today with City of London actors, lots of different development actors too yesterday at BII, is everybody needs to work together, and country platforms is a part of that. But we're seeing many more levers that are needed, from fiscal space creation to private sector mobilization to the banks having to actually churn through assets rather than just doing direct investment. I added that bit to get down to one question. And we do see the MDBs as like really important catalysts for that, for like really streamlining the ways in which development finance is delivered. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more on how you're planning to, in this sort of more complex ecosystem, bring different actors together. And I guess that goes for both the bank and for the FCDO. Thanks.
Well, Christina, just this colleague here, and then we'll let our panel briefly respond. Sorry to those folks who had their hands up in the room.
Hello, Harold Freeman. Hello, Harold Freeman from the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, and we're doing a review on energy transition, but this is a much broader question. My question is about sort of the big international capital markets and private finance. In the rush to mobilize private finance, it's great to hear from Valerie that you're thinking also about the poorest countries, but the reality is that investors want safe returns in markets they understand. How in this process do we ensure that the poorest countries, who are least attractive to markets, are not forgotten, but without also taking all the risk away from investors and just creating more moral hazard? Is that a realistic prospect without huge changes to the way those capital markets work? Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we've got adaptation limits, working together on fiscal issues, in particular, the poorest countries, and working together as a system. Do you want to start,
So
Valerie?
post 2030,
couple of minutes, so
Joe,
brief if you can.
Can't make any commitments. But I like to think that we're in the midst of huge MDB reform. This has been started under the G20. It continues. There's discussions on FFD. 100% of our finances for development, that means it's for climate. At the end of the day, even where we're investing in human capital development and based on taxonomies that isn't going to be triggered as climate finance, at the end of the day, that's going to ready local communities to be part of the new labor force that's needed for new economies, or that are going to be more resilient because they'll find a job. So the MDBs are going to grow. We're doing everything we can to make more capital available, which means we'll have more climate finance. When it comes to inhabitability, countries are already thinking about this and doing this. And there's three things that we've learned that are very important when we help countries think about having to move people because where they live will not become habitable. One is making sure that they can take their social and cultural capital with them. They stay together because it's such an important part of a community's sense of self and their ability to be resilient. Second is making sure when folks move, they move to somewhere where there are sites and services. There's an ability for jobs, there's existing infrastructure. They have an ability to continue up the rung on the ladders to development. And the third thing, and this is for smaller numbers of countries, is how do we figure out their legal ability to survive? And this is particularly for some small island developing states, where how do you continue as a nation if you no longer have territory? So we're doing a little bit of work with them to think through what it means for your UN seat, for example. If you don't exist anymore, you have to move your whole country somewhere else. And then finally, Rob, sorry, not finally. Yes, we need to be more effective, Rob. We need to think differently. That's why we're doing a lot of thinking around payment for results. I mean, some of the innovations we do in financial instruments is figuring out how do we create a supply chain of finance where we can move some of those precious grant resources to pay for results rather than pay for inputs with uncertain results. We started with the Rhino bond in South Africa. We've moved on to climate bonds. We've moved to water bonds. So it's thinking about how do you use those scarce grant resources? And again, how do you create a supply chain of partners so we're each doing our thing, as opposed to this competitive 100-meter sprint. We want a relay race where we hand the baton over to each other. And then finally, on the issue of aid impact, the big capital markets matter. The reason we have IDA is because we know it's harder to put money into some of what are perceived or real risks in some countries. But we don't just work with the big capital markets. We don't even just work in countries that have domestic capital markets. We want to make sure that local money markets, which in poor countries are where men and women go to get that small loan to put their kids to school or to prepay for seeds to plant that season, we need to make sure those money markets understand climate technologies, understand the role of nature as a technology, and will invest in those to shift them away from how they think about lending right now to make sure they're part of the climate coalition.
Very good. Debbie, would you help us with adaptation limits in particular? That's the online question that we had that I think we haven't spoken to.
Yeah, thanks. So on that one, we're doing quite a lot of thinking about environmental degradation and ecosystem loss. And I think it is at the moment an underplayed part of the conversation. Obviously, our colleagues who work in the CBD COPs are very, very focused on these issues. I think we need to bring this into the mainstream. A lot of it is about working out how we cost our natural assets and frankly value our natural assets much, much better, and start building that in, as I said, to our thinking about our supply chains and our long-term risks. Because if you can do that, you can show the real cost benefit analysis. You can start thinking about how you mitigate for long-term risk, but you can also start leveraging better the assets that you've got. Obviously, this spreads into conversations about loss and damage and a range of other actors, working on this. We're doing a lot of thinking at the moment about prearranged finance. We know that about 35% of climate crises are predictable and modelable, but only about 2% of crisis funding is prearranged. We would love to drive up that figure very significantly because frankly, it makes sense, it's cheaper, it's more effective, it's quicker, and it's one of the things we'll be working on in the coming years.
Right. I'm conscious of time. I know there's lots of questions left in the room, but let me finish. I suppose my takeaway from this is, we're all going to have to become comfortable and familiar with a wider range of policy interventions, if you like. Some of the ones we've mentioned, carbon markets, policy lending, mobilising pension assets, seeing what MDB reform delivers. And I think that's a challenge for all of us. And obviously the ultimate challenge is that those policy changes have impact and that we can measure that impact. So I think it's been a very rich conversation. Thank you both for making the time for it, and thanks for everyone for coming along.
Thanks, Ian.